What you see here on screen is probably one of the most expensive public toilets in the world. And no, don't worry, we haven't gone crazy. We haven't decided to make a video about public toilets. You'll soon understand why we're telling you this. The United States is a tremendously wealthy country with plenty of employment and amazing prosperity levels. The salaries of skilled workers are so stratospherically high that they put the rest of the world to shame, while their companies always appear at the top in terms of innovation and technological capacity. It's the country of the large multinationals, of Silicon Valley, of the great metropolises, and also of the most prestigious universities. In a way, the United States has been the real engine of the world for more than a century, from Ford to Nvidia, Boeing, McDonald's, Apple, Coca-Cola, and Amazon. It's the American empire, the dream destination of millions of immigrants and of the greatest economic revolutions. Nevertheless, VisualPolitik community, there is something surprising in this whole story that completely shatters this abundant success story. In the Americas, public construction and infrastructure are a real disaster. They are typically very old, poorly maintained, heavily used, and, in general, the feeling is that the whole system was stalled many decades ago. To give you an idea, in the land of Apple, Google, and Tesla, a quarter of all bridges have serious maintenance problems. Of the 15,500 dams that supply water and electricity to the American economy, 1 in 7 is in need of critical repairs. What's more, a 2016 study by the American Society of Civil Engineers estimated that the US urgently needed a serious investment of about $2 trillion just to bring existing infrastructure up to speed. Today, almost 8 years later, that figure is likely to be much higher. You only have to go down to the New York subway, the most famous subway in the world, to realize that something strange is going on in the United States. Dirt, awful smells, terribly deteriorated facilities. These are the things that can be found on a daily basis. But we are not only talking about subways. It's a very similar story with airports, roads, trains, and bridges. We're talking about a real national problem. The richest and most powerful country on the face of the earth is falling apart, at least as far as infrastructure is concerned. And surely many of you are clear about the problem. The country doesn't spend enough on public infrastructure. There is a lack of money, and infrastructure is not a priority. Well, partly, yes, but that's not really it. It's true that in relative terms, this country spends little on public works. For instance, while in the 1960s, Americans spent almost 3% of GDP each year, public investment in infrastructure plummeted to 1% in the 1980s. Since then, not only have things not improved, but they've gone from bad to worse. In recent years, government investment has barely stood at a paltry 0.7% of GDP. That's barely a quarter of the effort they made in the 1960s. However, that's not the real problem. The United States is a very rich country, and that percentage of GDP is still a huge investment. It turns out that 0.7% of US GDP is almost $200 billion per year. What's more, if we look at the latest OECD data, in 2021, the United States invested more in roads and railroads than all the countries of the European Union combined. Do you want a more concrete example? Well, without going any further, the New York Metropolitan Authority's investment plan calls for an investment of more than $11 billion per year. And there's even more. In recent years, Congress has passed 2 administration-driven programs that will pour hundreds of billions of additional dollars into the nation's infrastructure over the next few years. I am, of course, referring to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. However, since the problem is not how much is spent on public works, it is very likely that these plans will not really change the situation much. These plans will not bring about any major change. But then, if the problem lies in not how much the government spends, what on earth is going on in the US? Well, here we come to the key point of this whole story. The problem is not how much is spent, but that the money is not enough. The United States is probably the country with the most expensive public works in the world. And okay, I know it stands to reason that building in the United States is expensive. The problem is that we are not talking about a reasonable difference, but a colossal cost overrun. The plunder of plunders. And guess what? New York is a good example.
How NYC's 2nd Avenue subway became the world's most expensive line.
What you are looking at is one of the entrances to the 2nd Avenue subway that opened in 2017. It probably doesn't look like much. It looks like a normal station and a totally normal line. However, It is the first major expansion of the New York subway in 50 years, and most importantly, it is the most expensive subway line in the entire world. The first phase of this line cost about $2.4 billion per kilometer. This means that it was 8 to 15 times more expensive than metro projects in cities such as Stockholm, Paris, Tokyo, Berlin, or Madrid, and it's no exception. In general, work on the New York subway costs several times more than similar projects in other major cities around the world. But if the Second Avenue project already seemed expensive, cast an eye on this subway station under Grand Central Madison. It opened very recently, in 2013. It's a big station, very big, but above all, very expensive. The station, along with the 3.2 kilometers, that's just under 2 miles, of new track included in the project, cost, hold on to whatever is closest to you, a whopping $11 billion. For comparison, this is approximately what the Spanish high-speed line between Madrid and Barcelona cost, but with one major difference. In that case, we are talking about a high-speed railroad line of just over 620 kilometers, or 385 miles, not a conventional track of only 3.2 kilometers. The difference with the rest of the world is simply enormous. For instance, in another large metropolis that is also very wealthy and expensive, such as London, the cost of subway construction ranges between $500 and $800 million per kilometer. We are therefore talking about a real drain on the public budget. In other words, no matter how much is spent on public works, with such costs, hardly any work can be done. Because don't think that the subway or New York City are extraordinary cases. Building in the United States is so absurdly expensive that it is probably the only country where we can find crazy news items like this.
San Francisco is spending $1.7 million on one public toilet.
We are talking about a public restroom of only 14 square meters. And it's not just that it would cost almost $2 million, but also that it would not be in service until 2025. 3 years to build a small public restroom. Crazy. In fact, this is the second big problem this country has. Government-funded works are usually never-ending. They have lead times that can be even more absurd than the cost of the work itself. So the question, logically, is how on earth can this be possible? How can it be that building a small public restroom in a public space costs almost $2 million and it takes 3 very long years to complete the work? Do they install gold faucets and porcelain bricks delicately handmade by a craftsman in some forgotten workshop in the Swiss Alps? Well, obviously not. Extra costs and time lags basically clog up the system. For example, to build this San Francisco restroom, the city council contemplated hiring a consultant to manage this mega job. The cost? $175,000. Then there were accessibility and environmental impact studies and permits, the public information process, the design, more supervisors, and of course, the actual work itself, with the masons and the materials. I've already told you, crazy. Corruption? Insanity? Incompetence? You choose your own adjective. In the end, the scandal caused the work on this toilet to be suspended, for once. Because the truth is that we can find such ridiculous projects everywhere, including similar toilets in San Francisco itself, or, back to where we started, in New York. Remember this restroom that we showed you at the start of this video? It's the public restroom at Gravesend Park in Brooklyn. It cost $2 million. But do you want another example that is, how shall we put it, more significant than a simple bathroom? Well, let's take the California high-speed train project. The first bonds were issued 14 years ago to finance it. It was a $10 billion issue. Since then, not a single kilometer of track has been laid. Tons of money has been spent, and the total cost estimate has ballooned to $128 billion. If we adjust for inflation, that's an amount similar to the entire cost of the Apollo program that developed a bunch of spacecraft and put the first man on the moon. Of course, it's yet to be seen if this project ever sees the light of day. When the first bonds were issued to finance it, the project anticipated that the train would be operational in 2020. But as I said, right now, not a single mile of track has been laid, and there is already talk of the finish date being 2033. VisualPolitik community, the problem, obviously, is that if things cost so much, and takes so long to build, the result is that the existing infrastructure just gets older and more overloaded. And to top it off, new investments are barely enough to build anything decent. Not to mention that when they are launched, they are often outdated. For instance, trains that are inaugurated after spending a ton of money and run at speeds that in Europe would be considered a joke. It's a disaster. But what on earth is going on in the United States? How is it possible to have such an out-of-control situation? The American giant is obviously a very rich country, but not so rich as to justify this enormous difference. Well, let's go back to the example of New York to solve this mystery once and for all. Let's find out exactly what it is that explains why infrastructure in the United States has so many problems, and often looks like the public works infrastructure of an underdeveloped country. Listen up.
The curse.
As a matter of course, the outrageous cost of public works and the desperate slowness of their construction in the United States has nothing to do with the supervening curse or anything like that. As is always the case in life, there is a good explanation. In this case, we can find 4 main reasons that explain such a mess. To look at them one by one, we will use the New York subway as an example. But the truth is that these key issues can be extrapolated to the vast majority of problems in the United States. Well, the first reason is to be found in the labor force. And no, we are not referring to the fact that labor costs are high, which, yes, they sometimes are. However, in this case, it is much more specific. You see, in the United States, the public works sector is heavily unionized, and the agreements include all kinds of demands and restrictions. Some are as questionable and rigid as the fact that the workers must be from the same state where the work is being carried out, and in many cases, from the same city. In other words, construction workers, at least as far as public works are concerned, cannot have national mobility. That is, they cannot move to work temporarily in other states, as is the case in other countries. And what does this mean? Not only higher labor costs, but more importantly, lower productivity. Think about it. Since workers don't work on many similar sites, they don't specialize or learn to work with new construction techniques. And obviously, there are not highly specialized professionals in all locations. So this regulation also causes a significant shortage of these types of professionals. As a result, some very specific positions, such as crane operators, for instance, can command salaries of up to $500,000 per year. In Europe and Asia, this is completely different. The workers who build the subways sometimes come from other countries where they have already built subways, and that, logically, makes them more productive. What's more, agreements in the United States apply extra costs, such as employees working on weekends being paid double. And to top it off, construction sites hire many more people than necessary. Or rather, union requirements lead to the hiring of many positions that are not necessary. The result is that the labor cost of this type of work in the United States is many times higher than in other countries. So the question is, why all these regulations and excesses? Well, at this point, we have to take into account the electoral factor. You see, in the United States, very few people vote in municipal elections. In the last municipal elections in New York, voter turnout was only 13.8%. Yes, I know, I've already told you that 4 cats vote in these elections. And not surprisingly, if few people vote in the elections, and then you have a strongly unionized labor force that can be easily mobilized, well, let's not fool ourselves. That means that if you stand up to them, or set more limits than you should, you risk losing the elections. And of course, no politician wants to lose an election. But let's continue. In certain fields, the USA may be a cutting-edge country, but in the matter we're dealing with, the United States has fallen far behind the times, and this is particularly visible in the case of design. You see, one of the crucial elements for reducing costs in public works is to use more or less standardized designs. This is very clear in a subway line. It's normal that a new line in the station follows the same pattern and has similar equipment to existing lines. This, naturally, saves a lot of money. You buy large volumes and learn how to install it in the best possible way. However, in New York, it is not like that at all. In that city, construction continues to follow almost artisanal patterns. There is no standardization, either in the design of the stations, nor in the materials or systems used. So what is the problem? Well, it cancels out economies of scale, learning costs, and makes everything much slower. By the way, it also increases the cost of maintenance. But do you want a concrete example? Well, look, on the new 2nd Avenue line we were telling you about earlier, the stations don't even share the same escalator provider. Crazy. The result is that the systems and finishes cost a lot more than anywhere else on the planet, because nobody thinks of working like this more than Americans. And that's not all. On top of that, the buildings follow requirements that, in the modern world, no longer make much sense. For example, the subway stations on 2nd Avenue are huge. Very, very big. The 96th Street Station excavation was 2.6 times longer than the length of the platform, while in all other major cities, this difference is only between 3% and 20%. In other words, it's as if New Yorkers were practically building 3 stations in one. The problem is that this size adds nothing and doubles the expense. And why do they get so big? Well, the truth is that it doesn't make much sense. But the Americans put facilities, warehouses, and even offices underground that would be much cheaper to build above ground, as is done in the rest of the world's major cities, from Tokyo to London, through Paris, Madrid, and Seoul. In the United States, there is a strange paradox. Bureaucracy is very high in this type of matter, but at the same time, the resources of public agencies are very limited. This means that in order to carry out any evaluation or monitoring process, however small it may be, public agencies resort to private consultants who charge a fortune. What's more, and this is very striking, they use a very strange system known as design-build, which, to be honest, is not very common in other countries. This system stipulates that when a company bids for a public work, the award includes both the drafting of the project and its construction. In other words, the company that wins the tender decides how it will be built and is then in charge of doing it. The problem? This causes them to add all kinds of costs and expenses that are often not necessary, and then, once the work begins, it is unthinkable to change suppliers. So in a way, the company has the upper hand. Incidentally, it is not surprising that many civil servants in public agencies end up working in these companies. So draw your own conclusions. The result? Margins tend to be higher than those earned by companies in Europe and Asia for similar work. But let's move on. Not in such an exaggerated way, but something similar to what is happening in the United Kingdom that we saw recently here on VisualPolitik is also happening in the United States. In the United States, the public evaluation processes, as they are intended, mean that projects can be delayed or even litigated in 1,001 ways by neighbors, political pressure groups, or anyone who does not like the proposed project. And of course, the problem is that there is always someone who doesn't like a project. It is what is known as NIMBYism, the not in my backyard movement. There are many retirees who are particularly active in these causes. And of course, this delays the works a lot, sometimes up to more than a decade. It also makes the administrations themselves, well, let's say that many times they opt for projects that are much more expensive, but that bother less rather than choosing the most efficient ones. It is the cat that chases its own tail. Not surprisingly, an entire business has been created around these complaints, and this causes them to multiply. This is a problem that even the Democratic governor of California recognizes.
NIMBYism is destroying the state. Gavin Newsom ups pressure on cities to build more housing.
To give a concrete example, in Berkeley, a lawsuit succeeded in stopping a project to build a student residence by demanding a detailed report on whether the students themselves could constitute as an environmental hazard. Yep, that's what I said. But well, seeing everything that we have seen and how the dollars are flowing in the United States, surely now you will understand news stories like this better.
Ferrovial is desperately seeking the American dream. The Spanish-based company has made the United States the main target of its international expansion plan.
The United States has the budget and the potential to become a real cash cow for those construction companies that manage to do things a little better. We're talking about a country that has the best companies in the world, with some of the worst public administrations in the entire developed world. Of course, even there we can find some better examples. Not every state in the country is in such a bad way. In states like Texas and Arizona, the results are much better, and there are far fewer problems in getting large infrastructure projects off the ground. That explains why more large projects are being built in these states. But now that we've come this far, it's your turn. Did you know about this problem in the United States? How would you solve it? Leave us your impressions in the comments and let's start a debate. And if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like it. As always, thank you very much for watching. All the best. See you next time.